So Eva Doe, tech policy reporter for The Post, my colleague here. I have a question. Are you the kind of person who searches for stuff while you watch movies?
All the time, yes.
Right? Like when you're like, oh, where have I seen this actor before? Or what are the kinds of things that you search for?
Yeah. Like a lot of times, the actor looks familiar, but I can't quite remember who it is. Or I think like, what movie were they in before?
Yes.
Looking up character backstories.
Also, are they British? I feel like I always want to know, like, is this Southern accent authentic, or is this just like a random British person who's pretending to be an American? Well, let me tell you. So, and this is relevant to the conversation we're about to have. I was watching the movie Babes, and this is a very funny movie with Ilana Glazer, Michelle Buteau, and Hassan Minhaj. It's a movie about having kids and getting older and, families and just all that stuff. In the movie, Hassan Minhaj is a dad, and he's like interacting with the kid, and it was really cute. And I was like, wow, he seems like this can't just be acting. He must really be a dad. And so, of course, in that moment, I reach over and grab my phone, and I go into the internet browser and put Hassan Minhaj, is he a dad? And I got my answer very quickly, of course. Apparently, he has 2 children. But what I'm understanding now is that what I just did in searching on my phone for a thing is at the center of this court case between the U.S. government and Google.
Yeah, exactly. That's what this case has been about. So many times a day, we reach for Google search and we Google something. And is that some decision that we are making as consumers because we like Google search? Or is this a decision that's been made for us by the company?
In the case of me and my search the other night, I never decided to use Google. It was just the default on my iPhone. And last week, a federal judge ruled that that's a problem and that Google is using its market power illegally to crush its competition.
A federal judge has found that tech giant Google broke antitrust laws, acting illegally to maintain a monopoly in online search.
This was the government's biggest win against big tech in over 2 decades.
The last big antitrust ruling against a tech company was more than 20 years ago, against Microsoft. We're in an entirely...
This is a big deal. For so long, there was this common wisdom that monopoly law in the United States is really hard to use against tech companies and internet companies because the sector is changing so quickly and the law seems to be so far behind. It's a century old. And so this was a major test case that yes, this law still is usable against companies like Google.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Monday, August 12th. Today, the decision that could change Google, or Googling, as we know it. We're breaking down the details of the lawsuit and the ripple effect that this historic ruling could have on big tech. So, Eva, tell me a little bit of what led to this court case.
Well, Google's search engine has been so dominant among search engines for so long that actually there's been these allegations and complaints against the company for years and years. Back under the Obama administration, the FTC had done some investigating into, is Google breaking monopoly law with how it uses its search engine. And at that time, they didn't proceed with a case. And then around 4 years ago, under the Trump administration, the Justice Department decided to move forward and filed this case. It takes a while to move through the legal process. So it was the Biden administration's Justice Department that ended up taking it to court last year.
What's so interesting hearing about this case is that there's this question, is Google a monopoly? And I haven't thought of Google as a monopoly in the past. It does say something that when I think of what it means to use a search engine, I use the verb Google. I don't even think about the company, but just Googling is the act of searching for something online in my head in a way that I think is true for a lot of other people too.
Yeah, exactly. And I think for most consumers, it seems obvious that Google search has this extremely dominant position. More than 90% of searches are done using Google search. Legally, it's a trickier question to determine if a company is a monopoly or not. It depends on how the court decides to define the market. And so what Google was arguing was that people can also search things on TikTok or other places. And so, what seems like an obvious question is something that was debated a long time in court.
And Eva, as you pointed out, there have been questions for years about whether Google should be so dominant in the world of search engines. And this is something that has even been raised by Congress. We saw back in 2020, Google CEO Sundar Pichai testified to Congress, and he spoke to these allegations of Google being too big. Let's listen to a little bit of that testimony.
Congresswoman, users come to Google search. It is that traffic, and that's where our source of revenue comes from. So we are focused on providing users the information they are looking for. We work hard to earn their trust. We know competition for information is just a click away.
Thank you, Mr.
So tell me a little bit more about Google's search business and how it plays into the government's argument that Google is running a monopoly.
A big question in this case is, do people use Google because they like Google search and they just prefer it? Or is this somehow a business decision that's been made by the companies? And so a lot of the case focused on these contracts that Google had with Apple and other smartphone makers.
Tell me more about those contracts.
So if you buy a smartphone in the U.S., almost everyone will come out of the box preloaded with Google search as the default search engine.
That's iPhone and Android?
iPhone and Android. And between the two of them, that's nearly the whole smartphone market in the United States. And that's because Google has signed these contracts with each of these smartphone makers in which a requirement of the contract is that Google search is the default.
Oh, interesting. So that's not like an accident that when I search on my iPhone that it automatically is using Google to do that search. Like that was an intentional business decision that was made between Apple and Google.
Exactly. And part of what came out in the trial is that Google pays Apple billions of dollars a year in order to maintain that placement that every time someone buys an iPhone, when they take it out of the box and they go to search something, it's Google search that comes up.
But theoretically, like, what's wrong with that, right? Like, if Google wants to pay Apple billions of dollars so that their search engine is the preferred search engine on people's phones, like, they're paying for it. I mean, what's the problem here?
Yeah, exactly. That was Google's argument in it, which is saying, Apple has the choice. They could pick Google, they could pick Bing, and they chose Google because they thought consumers would prefer it. And what prosecutors sort of set out to show was that Google had sort of illegally used its market power to prevent other players from entering this market.
And tell me where the law fits into this. Like, if the judge in this case decided that it was illegal what Google had done to ensure that their search engine was used on everybody's phones, at least here in the U.S., like, what law does that violate?
So the law is really old. It's the Sherman Antitrust Act from 1890.
Really?
Yeah.
Wait, what does a law from 1890 have to do with like tech on our phones?
Well, that's part of why this case was a big deal, because some people felt, maybe this law's too antiquated, that it's been so long since this law's been used in a case like this.
And what does the law actually say?
So the law says that it's not just being a monopoly that's illegal. It's using your monopoly power to sort of stifle competition and to prevent other companies from competing with you.
Interesting. What I get confused about here is that when I think of a monopoly, I think of a company, usually a large company, that has edged out all the competition, but then uses the lack of competition to raise prices to whatever they want. Then, now that you don't have anyone else competing against you, you can charge whatever you want for this service because there's no one else to provide it to consumers. But here, like, Google doesn't charge me any money to use search, or at least it doesn't feel like they're charging me any money. What is the argument here about why this is bad for consumers to have one company with a monopoly over search?
That's why it's a slightly less obvious case. Like if Google was a service that consumers are paying and they're paying more, year after year than they did before, then that would be sort of like what we classically think about. For this, part of the Justice Department's argument was that because of this absence of competition, Google has been able to make its service worse, like slightly worse and slightly worse.
The quality of the service is going down rather than the price going up.
Exactly.
Well, let me ask you this. How is Google getting worse?
Well, prosecutors put out a number of arguments, but one major one was more ads. Before, if you search in Google, the most relevant things are coming up. And increasingly, there's more ads in the mix.
I feel like I'm sure you've encountered this. I encountered this when I Google is like you automatically now have to skip over. Used to be the first 2 things. Now it's the first 5 things. And now you're sort of scrolling down half the page to find something that seems like a legitimate result versus like clearly someone who's trying to sell you something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's sort of the angle for average consumers. And then this case also had to do with advertisers, which a lot of the times are small businesses. It can also be large businesses that are buying those ads. And sort of what the judge determined was because Google has this monopoly, it's been able to raise the prices for those advertisers year after year in a way that advertisers don't really have an alternative. If they want to reach people searching for stuff, they sort of have to keep buying Google ads.
And what has Google said in response to all this?
So Google is appealing this case. And what they've said throughout is they argue, first of all, that they're not a monopoly. They say, there's all sorts of ways, new platforms like TikTok that people are now using to search. They also say that that consumers choose Google, that they use Google because they like it and not because they're forced to. But here's a clip of Google's chief legal officer, Kent Walker, speaking with CBS News around the time when the trial was beginning.
We believe that people use Google because it's helpful. The case comes down to 2 important principles: competition and choice. Competition, you've never seen more choice, whether that's TikTok or Reddit or Amazon or Expedia.
And he argues that people want to use Google and that they can just switch their search engine anytime they want.
It really couldn't be easier. You can sit at home on your couch and change what search engine you're using. It's as easy as changing your shoes.
So now that the judge in this case has given the Justice Department a huge win, what does this mean for Google and for its search engine technology, which it sounds like is a huge part of its business?
That's the big question. So right now we're moving into the second phase of the trial in which the judge is going to determine what kind of fixes does the company have to make to sort of remediate this problem. And so sort of everything depends on that for Google. On the more severe side, the judge could order that Google has to break off a part of the company so it's not so monopolistic.
Oh, interesting. Like that they'd have to, in theory, like sell the search engine part or make it a different company or maybe sell the mail part, the Gmail part.
Yeah, exactly. That would be really bad for Google and would be sort of a worst case scenario.
What are some of the other scenarios?
I think one likely thing that'll be affected is Google's contracts that it has with Apple and these other companies. And so that's probably something the judge is going to take a close look at. Also, what the EU has done is when you buy a smartphone or something out of the box, you get a choice screen where you can pick what search engine do you want to set as your default.
I'm curious what people chose. Like, has that led to a more diversity in people's tech choices of who they want to use as their search engine provider?
A lot of times people are still going to just choose Google because they're used to it, because they like it. And that is what's happening with a lot of people in the EU, even though they have this choice now.
And so is there a world where Google actually benefits from this? Like, they still get most people using their search engine on most phones, but then they don't have to pay billions of dollars to maintain this dominant place in the market?
Yeah, it's really hard to say how this is going to go. It could be that the court, strikes these agreements and says, Google can't be paying Apple billions of dollars a year to have that default search engine status. And, it could be that Google just saves that money and consumers decide to keep using Google search anyway.
After the break, what this ruling could mean for other tech giants like Apple and Amazon, along with startups trying to break their way into the search engine market. We'll be right back. Eva, I'm curious about the bigger picture here, not just for Google, but also for tech in general. Like, what is this? What do the results of this case mean?
Partly why people have been watching this case so closely is it's the first big one of a series. So Google is not the only company being sued on antitrust grounds by the federal government right now. There's also a suit against Amazon, against Facebook's parent company, Meta. There are sort of a string of suits in the pipeline, and against Apple.
The Justice Department and more than a dozen states announced a sweeping antitrust lawsuit against Apple.
Now, it accuses the tech giant of monopolizing the smartphone market, and the lawsuits claim
Apple's probably the most similar case because it also revolves around how its dominance in smartphones sort of gives it this power over the ecosystem. Each case is going to be a bit different, and in that case, you can't really predict how this case is going to affect the other cases, but it's generated a lot of interest that the judge ruled this way in this case.
But when you think about tech right now, it just feels like that is the state of things. You have these gigantic companies that dominate whatever it is that they do. That Google is search engines. That obviously Androids are a thing too. But like Apple is like a dominant force because it has grown to be such day-to-day part of so many people's lives. And I guess it sounds like what you're saying is that the government is worried about the big picture here. That maybe we shouldn't have 5 or 6 companies that do the technology for near everything that we interact with on our phones or computers all the time.
And that's sort of why courts are taking a close look at these companies at this moment is sort of this recognition that it's not just one thing, that dominance in one thing sort of affects everything else. Like Google, it's not just their search engine. They're now doing all sorts of things, and sort of being the number one player in search gives it a leg up in a lot of other sectors also.
And who stands to gain here if there is a real shakeup, either when it comes to how Google can monopolize search or how other companies can monopolize what they do?
Well, that's going to depend partly on what the remedies are in this case, what Google has to change about its business. Likely sort of smaller competitors, what people term little tech, might be a beneficiary of this, just like a new startup to even get its foot in the door at this point. I think the outcome of this case means we are seeing this possibility of sort of third-party search engines and more niche search engines starting to gain some traction, which right now Microsoft's Bing is sort of the second contender, which a far-off second contender. And anything beyond that is really sort of a niche search engine right now. And a lot of them have really struggled to sort of keep financially viable for an extended period of time. And so, it's possible that this, depending on what the judge decides must happen in the market, that we see, these new search engine startups tailored towards kids' safety, that kids could use them for searching. You could have ones that are sort of specialized for special types of searches.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so it's possible that those could gain more traction now.
And Eva, I'm curious, as you continue to cover this case and some of these other cases that the U.S. government is bringing against big tech, what are you looking out for? And what are some of the questions that you have about how this ruling will play out and its impact in the tech world?
I think one question for the longer term that we won't be able to know the answer quite yet is how this affects the trajectory of the companies. And that, the previous big case before this was against Microsoft around the year 2000. And for that Analysts say it sort of slowed down Microsoft afterwards. Even though they ended up settling with the government, nothing grievous happened, like the company having to break up itself. But they just became more cautious. There was more lawyering. There was more sort of like concern of how this would affect things from antitrust standpoints when they're doing things. And that was sort of the point when Google sort of came to the forefront and the whole mobile era happened and Microsoft sort of fell behind in a lot of ways. So, is Google going to be able to keep its momentum regardless of the outcome of this specific case?
That'll be very interesting to watch. Eva, thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you so much.
Eva Doe reports on tech policy for The Post. The Post is reporting on so many other stories today. So before we go, here is one story that I am following right now. Ukraine and Russia appear to be heading toward a major showdown. Nearly a week ago, and for the first time since the war started, Ukraine stunned Russia by attacking and entering into Russian territory. This all took place in the Kursk region, about 7.5 miles into Russia. This marks the biggest cross-border attack since the war started in 2022, and it's the first military invasion into Russia since World War II. After the attack, Russian President Vladimir Putin acknowledged Ukraine's incursion, and he said he was meeting with his top officials.
У меня будет встреча с руководителями силовых ведомств, Министерства обороны, Генеральным штабом, ФСБ.
Russian officials have since ordered people living in the area under attack to evacuate. In all, this latest advance by Ukraine poses a big test for Russia and exposes an area of Russia that was supposed to be under tight control. At the same time, questions remain about Ukraine's goals and how long it intends to hold this area it's taken over. That is it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. If you want to show your support for the show, please subscribe to The Washington Post. Not only is it a great way to help us continue to do this work, but you can now get access to Washington Post podcasts ad-free in Apple Podcasts. Subscribe in Apple Podcasts or by following the link in our show notes. Today's show was produced by Ali Bianco with help from Alana Gordon. It was mixed by Sean Carter and edited by Monica Campbell. Thanks also to Trinity Webster Bass and James Graff. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from The Washington Post.